The Eldar had known nothing but mastery over the stars for as long as anyone could remember. Their cities, delicate as spun glass, reached into the sky, their shapes impossible to copy, their beauty undeniable. Everywhere there was light, soft, warm and constant, bathing their worlds in a peaceful glow. The Eldar had no need for darkness. They had long since conquered it. Their technology was not mechanical, not in the way humans or orcs would later understand. It was alive, pulsing with a gentle psychic hum. Even their starships were living things, made from wraithbone. A material pulled straight from the warp itself. Each craft moved silently, as if slipping between the folds of space rather than cutting through it. Planets that other species would struggle to colonize, the Eldar had turned into paradise. Gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see, the air perfumed with flowers that never wilted. There were no factories, no fields tilled by hand. Everything simply worked because the Eldar had willed it to be so. If there were any problems in this empire, they were invisible. No one wanted for anything. Life was about creation, about experiencing everything life could offer. Each Eldar pursued a craft, whether art, song, or something stranger, and took it to heights unimaginable. Time didn't matter. They lived for millennia, and if they tired of one pursuit, they would begin another, with the same patience and dedication. And so they grew inward. There were no wars, no real enemies to speak of. The galaxy was theirs, and there was nothing left to conquer. Their warriors, once proud and disciplined, had laid down their arms long ago, their weapons becoming more decoration than necessity. Their fleets sailed the stars not for battle, but for exploration, for beauty, for curiosity. It was in this time of stillness that they began to seek something else, something more. Their minds were restless. Perfection had been achieved, but it was not enough. They needed new experiences, new sensations. Some began to look inward, deep into their souls, searching for new heights of pleasure, of understanding. And what they found changed them. At first, it was harmless. A few Eldar sought out new ways to feel, pushing their psychic powers towards sensation. A small cult here, a gathering there. But as time passed, it grew. Pleasure became obsession. Entire cities turned to the pursuit of excess, a search for something beyond the physical, beyond the real. Eldar minds, once disciplined and sharp, began to bend in ways they never had before. What had been a slow drift toward hedonism became a plunge. There were warnings, whispered by the few who still had the clarity to see. Seers, those who peered into the future, spoke of shadows in the warp, of a dark presence growing stronger. But their words were ignored. What threat could there be? They were the Eldar. They had built an empire that no one could challenge. They were untouchable, or so they believed. Calith Tern stood on the edge of the balcony, overlooking the sprawling city beneath him. The evening light bathed the towers in a golden hue, their shimmering surfaces reflecting the last rays of the twin suns. It was a view he had seen countless times before, but something about it felt different tonight. The city, with its graceful arches and delicate spires, felt more distant, more alien than ever. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. It was a subtle sensation, something at the edge of his mind, like a whisper he couldn't quite hear. He'd noticed it growing over the years, but lately it had become harder to ignore. The gatherings, the parties, the endless indulgence. It had all started to lose its meaning. Once, the pleasure had been enough. But now, it all felt hollow. A soft chime echoed through the air, breaking his thoughts. He turned to see a figure stepping through the arched doorway. Navara moved with a grace that seemed effortless, her long robes flowing behind her like a shadow. Her eyes, dark and sharp, fixed on him with a knowing smile. "You've been avoiding me, Calith," she said, her voice low and smooth. "I was starting to think you'd grown tired of us." Caliph smiled faintly, but didn't respond right away. He turned back to the view, watching the sun dip lower on the horizon. "I needed time to think," he said finally. Navarra stepped closer, her presence almost overwhelming. There was something about her, something more than just physical beauty. She exuded a sense of power, of control. It was what had drawn him to her in the first place, all those centuries ago. "And what is it that troubles you, old friend?" she asked, her tone teasing. "The world is at your feet, as it always has been. What more could you want?" He hesitated. How could he explain it? It wasn't something as simple as boredom. There was an emptiness, something missing that he couldn't quite name. The same indulgences that once brought him joy now left him feeling cold. He had seen everything, felt everything. What more was there? "I don't know," he admitted, his voice quiet. "I just feel detached." Navarra's smile widened. "Then you've come to the right place. We've all felt it, Caliph. That need for something more, that hunger. It's why we started the gatherings in the first place. You've only scratched the surface of what's possible." Caliph glanced at her, intrigued despite himself. The gatherings, it had been years since he'd truly participated. He remembered the early days, when it was all new, when the sensations were overwhelming. The psychic link they shared in those moments, the blending of minds and emotions, was like nothing else in the universe. But even that had begun to fade. "What do you mean?" he asked. Navarra's eyes gleamed. "There are deeper paths to explore, Caliph, places we haven't gone yet. You know that as well as I do." She stepped closer, her hand brushing his arm. "Come to the gathering tonight. Let me show you." He hesitated for a moment longer, but the truth was he was curious. He couldn't deny that. Despite his reservations, despite the unease that had been growing inside him, he still wanted to know. "All right," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'll come." The hall was filled with a soft, pulsing light, its source unclear. Eldar lounged in silken cushions, their expressions relaxed, their minds already drifting into the psychic currents that flowed through the room. The air was thick with the scent of exotic flowers and incense, mingling with something deeper, yet something almost metallic. Caliph entered slowly, his gaze sweeping over the familiar faces. He recognized most of them, nobles, scholars, artists, those who had always sought more, who had always pushed the boundaries of sensation. Navarra was waiting for him at the center, her smile welcoming, but there was a sharpness to her eyes now, a hunger that hadn't been there before. She gestured for him to join her, and he stepped into the circle. The others shifted slightly, making space for him. "Close your eyes," she whispered, her voice low and soothing. "Let yourself go." Caliph obeyed, shutting out the room around him, focusing on the sound of his breathing. The psychic connection formed almost immediately, like slipping into a warm pool of water. He could feel the others now, their minds touching his, their emotions bleeding into his own. It was a familiar sensation, but deeper this time, stronger. At first, it was comforting. The boundaries between them dissolved, and he felt himself merging with the group. Pleasure flowed through the connection, a shared warmth that enveloped them all. But then, slowly, it began to shift. The warmth turned to heat. The pleasure became something sharper, more intense. Caliph's breath quickened as the sensations overwhelmed him. It was like fire coursing through his veins, but not painful, not yet. He could feel Navarra's mind guiding him, pushing him deeper into the link, into the storm of sensation that roared around them. It was exhilarating, terrifying, and he couldn't pull away. Then, in the middle of it all, he felt it. A presence. It was subtle at first, a shadow at the edge of his consciousness. But it was there, growing stronger with each passing moment. It didn't belong to any of them. It wasn't part of the link. It was something other. Caleth's eyes snapped open, and the connection broke. He stumbled back, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The others remained where they were, lost in the psychic current, unaware of what had just happened. Only Navarra stood watching him, her expression unreadable. "You felt it," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Caleth nodded, his mouth dry. What was that?" Navarra smiled, but there was no warmth in it this time. "It's what we've been searching for, Caleth, the thing that's been waiting for us all this time. It's beautiful, isn't it?" He shook his head, the unease growing into a knot of fear. "That wasn't beautiful, Navarra. That was something else, something dark." Her eyes flashed, and she stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You don't understand yet, but you will. We're on the verge of something incredible, something beyond anything we've ever known. This is what we've been waiting for. What you've been waiting for." Caleth backed away, his mind racing. He didn't know what he had felt, but it was wrong. He could still feel the echo of it, like a cold hand on his soul. "I need to go," he muttered, turning toward the exit. Navarra didn't stop him. She simply watched, her smile widening. "You can't run from this, Caleth," she called after him. "It's already begun." The night air was cool against his skin as he stepped outside. But it did nothing to calm the turmoil inside him. The city stretched out before him, the lights of 1,000 towers blinking in the distance. But they seemed dimmer now, as if the darkness was pressing in, creeping closer. Caleth took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to think, had to understand what was happening. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had been set in motion, something he couldn't stop. He looked up at the stars, their cold light flickering against the blackness of the sky. For the first time in his long life, Caleth felt truly afraid. Far from the decadent sprawl of the core worlds, the craft worlds moved silently through the cold void of space. They had been drifting for years, their great wraithbone hulls glowing faintly against the blackness. Inside, they were alive, not just with the Eldar who inhabited them, but with the very ship itself. The psychic energy of the Seers coursed through the craft worlds like blood through veins, binding everything together. Seer Melinos stood at the edge of one such craft world, the expanse of stars stretching before him like a vast ocean. He watched them quietly, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind turning over the same thoughts it had for decades now. He had seen this future long ago, before the first craft world even left the Empire's grasp, before the warnings had become undeniable. He knew what was coming. The visions had been clear, too clear. The heart of the Eldar Empire would fall, consumed by something dark and terrible, something that had been born of their own indulgence. Slaanesh. The name was still little more than a whisper in the warp, but it was growing louder with each passing year. And yet, despite the warnings, despite the signs, they had stayed. Most of them had remained behind, still lost in their hedonistic pursuits, still convinced that they were untouchable. But Melinos knew better. He had seen the future, and there was no saving them. Not now. "They're still not listening, are they?" a voice behind him said, pulling him from his thoughts. Melinos didn't turn. He knew the voice well. Lyrian, one of the younger Seers, though no less powerful. She stepped up beside him, her gaze following his out to the stars. "No," he replied quietly. "They haven't listened in centuries. Why would they start now?" Lyrian sighed, her brow furrowing as she leaned against the railing. "I thought maybe this time it would be different, with the visions growing stronger, with the disturbances in the warp." "It doesn't matter," Melinos interrupted, his voice calm but heavy with resignation. "They've grown too arrogant, too blind. They can't see what's coming because they don't want to." A silence stretched between them, the hum of the craft world, the only sound in the stillness of space. Below, Melinos could sense the activity of the ship, the Eldar preparing, packing, moving in orderly fashion. They were a disciplined people here, a stark contrast to the chaos of the core worlds. "We need more time," Lyrian said finally, turning to look at him. "There are still many more out there, those who haven't yet fallen to excess. If we could reach them, if they understood what we've seen." Melinos shook his head slowly. "We've tried, Lyrian, and we'll keep trying, but we can't stay here much longer. The longer we wait, the more we risk losing everything." She opened her mouth to respond, but stopped short, her gaze shifting as a figure approached. It was Corian, another of the Seers, his face tight with urgency. "Melinos," Corian said, nodding briefly to Lyrian before focusing on the Farseer. "There's been a disturbance in the warp." Melinos felt a chill creep up his spine, though he kept his face impassive. "Show me." The room where the Seers gathered was dimly lit, its walls inscribed with intricate runes that glowed faintly in the dark. In the center, a pool of shimmering light rippled with energy, a portal to the warp that allowed the Farseers to look beyond the veil of reality. Melinos stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the portal, his heart heavy with the weight of what he knew he would see. Lyrian and Corian stood beside him, their faces tense. The other Seers in the room murmured quietly to one another, their voices filled with apprehension. "We detected the disturbance just before sunrise," Corian explained, gesturing to the portal. "It's growing stronger, faster than before." Melinos nodded once and took a deep breath before stepping closer to the pool. He could feel the warp pressing against the edges of his mind, its currents swirling with power and danger. Reaching out with his thoughts, he let the psychic energy wash over him, pulling him deeper into the immaterium. At first, it was calm, the familiar shifting tides of the warp, full of potential and promise. But beneath that surface, there was something darker, something vast and terrible. The visions came quickly now, faster than they had before. He saw flashes of the future, worlds burning, Eldar cities reduced to ash, their people consumed by a force they could not escape. And at the center of it all, a shadow. No, not a shadow. A figure, something beautiful and horrifying all at once. Something that radiated power and desire, something that consumed everything in its path. Slaanesh. The name echoed through his mind, and he felt the pressure of it, the sheer weight of its presence. It wasn't fully formed yet, not entirely, but it was close, too close. Melinos pulled back from the vision with a sharp intake of breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The room was silent now, all eyes on him. "It's worse than we thought," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's coming faster than we predicted. We don't have much time." Lyrian's eyes widened. "But we've only just begun preparations. There are still so many who—" "We can't save them all," Melinos cut her off, his voice firm now. "The best we can do is save those who will listen. The craft worlds are ready. We need to leave." There was a heavy silence in the room, the weight of his words pressing down on them all. Lyrian looked as though she wanted to argue, but she remained silent, her gaze dropping to the floor. "We'll send out one final message," Melinos continued, his tone resolute. "To any who will listen, but after that, we leave." The message went out across the stars, a psychic signal sent from the craft worlds to the far reaches of the Empire. It carried the warnings of the Seers, the visions of the coming doom, the plea for those who had not yet fallen to heed the call. But even as the message spread, Melinos knew that most would not respond. Most would ignore it, just as they had ignored all the warnings before. Days passed, and slowly ships began to arrive. Not many, just a few here and there, carrying Eldar who had grown tired of the indulgence, who had sensed the wrongness creeping into their lives. They were the ones who had never quite fit in with the excesses of the core worlds, the ones who still valued discipline and tradition. They were not enough. Melanos stood at the edge of the landing platform as the last ship touched down, its passengers rose, stepping off one by one. He watched them in silence, his heart heavy with the knowledge that this was all that remained of the Eldar who could be saved. The rest were lost. "It's time," Lyrian said softly from beside him. Melanos nodded, his gaze still fixed on the ships. "Begin the departure sequence." The craft world stirred to life around them, the hum of psychic energy growing stronger as the massive ships prepared to leave. One by one, they lifted off, their great wraithbone hulls glowing faintly as they moved toward the stars. Melanos turned away from the platform, his thoughts dark. But to Rindu, this was not a victory. It was an escape, and even then, he wasn't sure if it would be enough. As the craft worlds drifted into the blackness of space, the shadow of Slaanesh loomed ever closer, and Melanos knew that no matter how far they went, the darkness would follow. The first exodus had begun, but the fall of the Eldar was far from over. Calith returned to the gatherings, though with a wariness that hadn't been there before. The night on the balcony with Navara had unsettled him. He had felt something that evening, something cold and ancient beneath the surface of their rituals. It was as if the currents of pleasure they shared were feeding a presence, something more than the group's collective emotions. But no one else seemed to notice, no one else seemed to care. And yet, despite his unease, Calith couldn't stay away. The lure of the gatherings was too strong, the sense of unity, of being part of something greater, something deeper, pulled him back each time. It was different from anything else the Eldar had experienced, a way to push the limits of sensation, far beyond what their physical bodies could offer. The psychic link that tied them together in these moments was intoxicating, and he found himself craving it more and more. Tonight the hall was filled with a deeper, darker energy than ever before. The familiar faces were there, nobles draped in the finest robes, their expressions calm, their movements languid. But there was something new, something sharper in the air. The soft light flickered strangely, casting long shadows across the room, and the scent of incense was thick, almost suffocating. Calith made his way through the gathering, his eyes scanning the room. Navara stood at the center, as she always did, her back to him, her arms outstretched as if welcoming him into some unseen fold. The others were already beginning to form the circle around her, their minds reaching out to one another, weaving the threads of the psychic link that would soon envelop them all. For a moment he hesitated, the memory of that cold presence still lingering in the back of his mind. But Navara turned to him, her eyes meeting his across the room, and the hesitation melted away. She smiled, that same knowing smile she always wore, and gestured for him to join her. "Come, Calith," she said, her voice carrying through the air, smooth and warm. "You're just in time." He stepped forward, drawn to her by something he couldn't fully explain. The others made space for him in the circle, their eyes closed, their minds already touching his, pulling him into the shared current. He could feel their thoughts, their emotions mingling with his own, blending into a single stream of sensation. It was familiar, comforting, and yet something was different. As the link deepened, Calith felt the usual rush of pleasure, the warmth that flowed through his mind and body as the boundaries between them dissolved. But underneath it, there was something else, an intensity, a hunger that hadn't been there before. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, but as the link grew stronger, so did the hunger. He could feel it pulling at him, drawing him deeper into the current, into the storm of emotions that swirled around them. The others were lost in it, their faces serene, their minds completely open to the flow. But Caleth could feel something else there with them, something that didn't belong to any of them. It was the same presence he had felt that night, the same cold, ancient force, but stronger now, more insistent. It was as if the rituals, the excesses they indulged in, were feeding it, giving it shape, giving it power. And it was watching them, waiting. His breath quickened, his pulse racing as the hunger pressed down on him, suffocating. He tried to pull back, to break the link, but it held him fast, dragging him deeper into the storm. His thoughts blurred with the others, his senses overwhelmed by the sheer force of their emotions, and he could feel himself slipping, losing control. Caleth! Navara's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and clear, pulling him back from the edge. He opened his eyes, gasping for breath, and found her standing before him, her gaze piercing. "You're holding back." He started, his voice shaking, but she held up a hand, silencing him. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked, stepping closer, her voice low and hypnotic. "You've felt it for a long time now, that presence, that power. It's what we've been searching for, all of us. It's what you've been searching for." Caleth shook his head, trying to clear the fog from his mind. This isn't what I wanted, Navara. This isn't right." She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't understand yet, but you will. You're still clinging to the old ways, to the rules that no longer apply. We've moved beyond them, Caleth. We've found something greater, something far more beautiful than anything we've ever known." He stammered, stepping back, but she followed him, her eyes gleaming with a strange, dangerous light. "You're afraid," she said softly, "because you don't understand. But once you let go, once you embrace it, you'll see, you'll feel it." Caleth's heart pounded in his chest, and he could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him, suffocating. The presence was still there, lurking at the edges of his mind, hungry, waiting. He wanted to run, to break free from the gathering, from Navara, from everything, but he couldn't. The pull was too strong. "Join me," Navara whispered, her hand reaching out to him. "Let go of your fear, Caleth. Embrace what we've become." For a moment, he stood frozen, torn between the part of him that screamed for him to run, and the part that was already sinking deeper into the void. And then, slowly, he reached out and took her hand. The next few nights passed in a blur of sensation. The gatherings grew darker, more intense, as if the presence that lingered among them had taken hold, guiding them down a path they no longer controlled. The psychic links between them became tighter, stronger, and the pleasure they once sought now became something sharper, something closer to pain. Caleth found himself swept up in it, his mind lost in the storm of emotions that swirled around him. There was no longer any separation between them, no boundaries, no limits. The others had given themselves fully to the presence, to the hunger, and he could feel it feeding off them, growing stronger with each passing day. It wasn't long before the gatherings began to change. The rituals, once simple acts of psychic connection, became darker, more twisted. They pushed their minds and their bodies beyond anything they had ever done before, seeking new heights of sensation, of power. And the presence watched, always watching, its hunger growing, with every offering they made. Caleth could feel it now, the weight of it pressing down on his soul. It whispered to him in the darkness, promising him power, promising him ecstasy beyond anything he had ever known. And yet, beneath the promises, there was something else, something darker. He saw it in the others, their eyes hollow, their faces gaunt, their minds no longer their own. They had given themselves to the presence completely, and it had consumed them, piece by piece. Caleth knew that if he stayed, if he continued down this path, it would consume him too. But still, he couldn't leave. There was no escape now. The presence had already taken root in his soul, and no matter how far he ran, no matter how hard he tried to break free, it would always find him. It was a part of him now, as much a part of him as the psychic powers he had once wielded so effortlessly. One night as the gathering reached its fevered peak, Caleth felt the presence more strongly than ever before. It pressed down on him, suffocating, overwhelming, and he knew in that moment that there was no turning back. He had already embraced damnation, and there was no escape. Navarra watched him from across the room, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. She could see it in him, the surrender, the acceptance. He was one of them now, truly one of them. "Welcome," she whispered, her voice carrying through the storm of sensation. "Welcome to the future, Caleth." And as the darkness closed in around him, he felt the present smile. The Farseers had seen it all coming, but their warnings fell on deaf ears. In the ancient halls of the craft world Ulthwé, a gathering of Eldar mystics stood in silence. The room was dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of the wraithbone structures that spiraled around them, pulsing faintly with the psychic energy that flowed through the ship. These were no ordinary Eldar. They were the visionaries, those who could peer into the warp and see the shifting currents of fate itself. But lately, what they saw filled them with dread. Farseer Melanos sat at the head of the circle, his hands resting lightly on the polished stone table. His face was a mask of concentration, his eyes closed as his mind wandered the paths of the future. Around him, the other seers waited in uneasy silence. The visions had been growing more frequent, more vivid, and more terrifying. Lyrian, standing at his side, shifted uncomfortably. She could sense the turmoil swirling in the warp, the currents darker than they had ever been. The others felt it too, though none of them spoke. There was an unspoken understanding between them, a recognition that something terrible was on the horizon. They had known it for a long time, but now it felt closer, more real. At last Melanos opened his eyes, his gaze heavy with the weight of what he had seen. He looked at each of them in turn, his expression grim. "The fall is nearly upon us," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Slaanesh is almost awake." A ripple of unease spread through the room, but no one spoke. They had all seen it in their visions, the terrible, beautiful entity stirring in the warp, growing stronger with every passing moment. It fed on the excesses of the Eldar, on the emotions that radiated from the core worlds like a beacon, drawing it ever closer to birth. They had tried to stop it, tried to warn their people, but their cries had been ignored, drowned out by the sounds of laughter, of music, of pleasure. "How much time do we have?" Lyrian asked, her voice quiet but steady. Melanos hesitated, his brow furrowed in concentration as he sifted through the tangled threads of fate in his mind. "Not long. A few months, perhaps. Maybe less." Another wave of unease swept through the room. The Farseers had been warning of the coming disaster for centuries, but the time for vague predictions was over. It was happening now. The future they had feared for so long was finally here. One of the younger seers, Talindra, leaned forward, her face pale. "We need to warn them again. Send out another message to the core worlds. If we could just get through to them—" "They won't listen," Melanos interrupted, his tone sharp but not unkind. "They haven't listened in centuries. They're too far gone." Lyrian nodded slowly. She had seen it herself, the madness that had taken root in the heart of their empire. The Eldar had once been a noble people, disciplined, restrained. But now they were lost to the pursuit of pleasure, of sensation, of power. The rituals that had once been sacred had become twisted, dark. Entire cities had fallen into ruin, not from war or famine, but from decadence, from indulgence taken too far. But worse than the destruction of their cities was the destruction of their souls. The Eldar had always been a proud people, confident in their mastery of the psychic arts, in their control of the warp. But now that control was slipping, the presence of Slaanesh, though not yet fully formed, could be felt in the warp, its influence growing stronger with every act of excess. The god was feeding on them, growing fat on their emotions, on their indulgence, and they didn't even realize it. "We have to try," Talindra insisted, her voice trembling. "There are still some who can be saved, some who haven't completely fallen. If they understood the danger, if they saw what we've seen, they would do nothing," Lyrian said softly, cutting her off. She turned to Melanos, her face grim. "We've been down this path before. They've been blinded by their own arrogance. They believe nothing can touch them. Not even the warp." Melanos nodded in agreement. It was true. The warnings of the Seers had been dismissed as the ramblings of overcautious mystics. The Eldar rulers were confident in their power, in their mastery over the warp. They believed that nothing could challenge them, that no force could rise to threaten their empire. And so they continued to indulge, even as the shadows in the warp grew darker, even as Slaanesh's presence loomed ever closer. "We will send one final message," Melanos said at last, his tone resigned. "But I don't expect it to change anything." Lyrian sighed, her shoulders sagging with the weight of her frustration. "What about the craft worlds? What about the Exodus?" Melanos glanced out at the stars beyond the window, his thoughts distant. The craft worlds were their last hope. The massive ships, each one a world unto itself, had been built in secret, far from the prying eyes of the core worlds. They had been designed as sanctuaries, places where the Eldar could preserve their way of life, their culture, in the face of the coming storm. Many of the Farseers had already fled to the craft worlds, bringing with them those few who had heeded their warnings. But they were not enough. The vast majority of their people remained in the core worlds, oblivious to the doom that awaited them. "The craft worlds are ready," Melanos said quietly, "but there are still many more we need to reach. We've gathered as many as we can, but—" He trailed off, his expression dark. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew the truth. Most of their people would not survive what was coming. Lyrian's hand tightened into a fist at her side. "Then we leave soon. We can't wait for the rest of them. The longer we stay, the closer we are to destruction." Talindra looked as though she might argue, but the look on Melanos's face silenced her. The Farseer was right. The craft worlds had to leave, and soon. If they waited too long, the rising tide of Slaanesh's influence would sweep them away, along with the rest of their people. "I'll begin the preparations," Lyrian said, turning on her heel and striding toward the door. "Wait," Melanos called after her, his voice halting her in her tracks. "Before you go, you should see what's happening now." He turned back to the shimmering pool in the center of the room, gesturing for the others to follow. Lyrian hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her expression wary. The other Seers joined them, forming a circle around the pool. The light that emanated from it was soft, almost soothing, but the energy that rippled beneath the surface was anything but. Melanos reached out with his mind, touching the surface of the warp, and the pool responded immediately, its glow intensifying. The room seemed to darken, and the air grew thick with the psychic energy that poured from the portal. The others followed his lead, their minds joining his, weaving together in a single unified thread. And then the visions came. At first it was a familiar sight, the great cities of the Eldar Empire, their towers stretching high into the sky, gleaming in the sunlight. But the beauty was short-lived. The buildings began to crumble, their walls cracking and splintering as darkness crept in from the edges. The skies darkened, the stars flickering out one by one, until there was only the void. In the center of it all, a figure emerged. It was humanoid in shape, but its features were blurred, indistinct, as if it was not yet fully formed, but the power that radiated from it was unmistakable. It was a force of pure hunger, of desire, and it reached out with tendrils of darkness, consuming everything in its path. Slaanesh. The name echoed through their minds, and the Seers recoiled, their psychic link shattering as the vision faded. The room fell into an uneasy silence, the air heavy with the weight of what they had seen. "There is no stopping it," Melinos said quietly, his voice filled with sorrow. "Slaanesh will be born, and when it happens, the Empire will fall." Lyrian closed her eyes, her heart sinking. They had known this was coming, but to see it so clearly, so vividly, was another thing entirely. There was no more time. They had to leave. "We send the message," she said, her voice steady despite the dread that filled her. "And then we go." And as the craft worlds began their final preparations, the darkness in the warp continued to grow. The birth of a god drawing ever closer. Calith had begun to lose track of the days. The gatherings now seemed endless, each one bleeding into the next, the line between day and night blurring in the soft, pulsing glow of the ritual chambers. He had long since surrendered to the currents that flowed through these halls, the psychic energies that bound him to the others, to Navara, to the presence that lurked just beneath the surface of their shared mind. It was always there now, in every thought, in every breath, in every flicker of emotion that passed between them. At first, it had been subtle, a faint whisper at the edges of his consciousness, a cool hand brushing against his soul. But now it was unmistakable, strong, commanding, insatiable. It had grown, feeding on their excess, on their indulgence, growing more powerful with each gathering, with each dark ritual. And still they continued, despite the warnings, despite the sense of impending doom that hung over them like a storm cloud. They could not stop. Perhaps they didn't want to. Or perhaps they were already too far gone to even care. Calith could feel it more clearly than ever now. The presence, the thing that had once been nothing more than a distant shadow, was close, so close. He had felt it in the last gathering, a pulsing hunger that seemed to reach out and touch him, pull him in, consume him. And he had let it. He had let it because there was no other choice. He wandered through the streets of the city, the night air cool against his skin, but the chill that ran through him came from somewhere deeper. The lights of the towers flickered above him, the great spires of Eldar civilization casting long shadows across the ground. Once he had taken pride in these cities, in their beauty, in their power, but now they felt hollow. The streets were quiet, empty, as though the life had drained out of them. Perhaps it had. The Eldar had retreated into themselves, into their pleasures, into their indulgence. The halls that had once been filled with scholars and artists, with warriors and diplomats, now echoed with nothing but the sounds of their excess. The great palaces had become dens of hedonism, the once great culture of the Eldar reduced to a twisted shadow of its former glory. And still the darkness grew. Calith turned a corner and found himself standing before the entrance to the hall. The door was open, a faint light spilling out onto the street. He could hear the sounds of the gathering already. Soft laughter, the murmur of voices, the faint hum of psychic energy weaving through the air. He hesitated for a moment, his hand hovering just above the doorframe. He didn't want to go inside, not this time, not after what he had felt in the last ritual. But he couldn't stay away. The pull was too strong, the hunger too overwhelming. With a sigh, he stepped inside. The hall was as it always was. Soft light, luxurious furnishings, the air thick with the scent of incense and flowers. But there was a tension in the room tonight, something different. The others were already gathered, their faces serene, their minds already beginning to link, already beginning to merge into the psychic current that flowed between them. Navara stood at the center, her back to him, her arms outstretched as though welcoming him into the fold. He could feel her mind reaching out to his, the familiar warmth of her presence, brushing against his thoughts. But tonight, there was something else there, something cold, something dark. "Caleth," she said softly, without turning to face him. "You're just in time." He stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. He could feel the others now, their minds already entwined, already sinking into the ritual. The psychic energy in the room was thick, almost suffocating, and it buzzed in his ears, in his bones. He could feel the pull of it, the way it reached out and touched him, drawing him in. "Something is coming," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. Navara smiled, turning to face him at last. "Yes," she agreed, her eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "It is." Caleth swallowed hard, his throat dry. "And you're not afraid?" "Afraid?" Navara laughed softly, the sound sending a shiver down his spine. "Why should I be afraid? We've been preparing for this for centuries, Caleth. It's what we've always wanted, to go beyond the limits of flesh, of mind, of the material world, to become something more." Caleth shook his head. "This isn't what we wanted. This isn't." "Right." Her smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "You don't understand, Caleth. Not yet, but you will. The presence you feel, the power we've been touching. It's not just a part of us. It's what we've become. We've ascended beyond the old ways, beyond the old gods. And soon we will stand with the new." He could feel it now, more clearly than ever, the presence, the hunger, the storm that had been building in the warp. It was so close, so powerful, and it was pressing down on them, pressing into their very souls. And Navara, she welcomed it. She reveled in it. But Caleth wanted to run. He could feel the weight of it, the crushing force of the storm bearing down on them. And he knew, in that moment, that there was no escape. It was too late. The darkness had already consumed them. The rituals they had performed, the pleasure they had sought, had fed something far greater than themselves. And now it was coming to claim them. The others had already begun the ritual, their minds merging into the psychic link, their emotions flowing together in a twisted current of desire, fear, ecstasy, and pain. Caleth felt it pull at him, pulling him deeper into the storm, and he tried to resist, tried to break free. But the pull was too strong. As the link solidified, he could feel the presence more clearly than ever. It was vast, monstrous, and it filled the space between their minds, weaving through their thoughts like a spider weaving its web. It was ancient, older than anything Caleth had ever known, and it was hungry, so hungry. The storm in the warp swelled around them, and Caleth could feel the psychic energies tearing at his mind, tearing at his soul. The others were lost in it now, their faces twisted in ecstasy and agony, their bodies convulsing as the presence devoured them from within. Navara stood at the center of it all, her arms raised high, her face serene. She was smiling, her eyes closed, her mind completely open to the storm. She had given herself to it, completely, utterly, and now she was part of it. The presence roared through the link, and Caleth felt himself pulled under, dragged down into the depths of the storm. The currents of psychic energy crashed against him, tearing him apart piece by piece, and he could feel the presence sinking its claws into his soul, devouring him. But even as he fell, even as the darkness consumed him, he felt a part of him resist. It was small, barely a flicker, but it was there, a spark of something that hadn't been touched by the presence, something that still belonged to him. He clung to it with everything he had, holding on to that last piece of himself as the storm raged around him. The presence howled in fury, its hunger insatiable, and Caleth felt it tear at him, trying to rip that last piece away. But he held on. Somehow, he held on. When Caleth opened his eyes, the hall was silent. The storm had passed and the others lay scattered around the room, their bodies still, their minds shattered. Navara stood in the center, her eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural light. The presence was still there, lurking just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. It was not fully formed yet, but it was close, so close. Caleth pushed himself to his feet, his body trembling. The storm in the warp was still building, growing stronger with every passing moment, and he knew, without a doubt, that the end was coming. Slaanesh was almost here, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The skies over the Eldar homeworlds were quiet, too quiet. A heavy, unnatural stillness hung in the air, pressing down on the cities, on the once vibrant streets that had, for millennia, been alive with laughter, with music, with the sounds of indulgence. Now there was only silence. The great towers that had once gleamed with light and life stood dark, their sharp angles casting long, foreboding shadows across the ground. Caleth felt it, deep in his bones, in his soul, the sense that something terrible was coming. He had felt it building for years, ever since the first whispers had begun to creep into his mind, ever since the first time he had felt the presence that lurked just beyond the edge of reality. But now that presence was no longer distant. It was here. It had come for them. The storm that had been growing in the warp was no longer a distant threat. It had broken through, its fury ripping apart the fabric of reality, and Caleth could feel the pressure of it pressing down on him, suffocating. The air itself felt thick, charged with a dark energy that vibrated in the back of his mind, a constant hum of impending doom. He wasn't alone in feeling it. Across the cities, across the entire empire, Eldar were beginning to sense the same thing, the cold, dark hand of something reaching out from the warp, pulling them toward it. He stood on a balcony overlooking the city, his eyes scanning the horizon, but the familiar view offered no comfort now. Everything felt wrong. The colors of the sky were muted, the light dimmer than it should have been, as though the suns were being swallowed by a vast shadow that hung just beyond the reach of his sight. Navara had vanished. After the last ritual, she had disappeared into the shadows, and Caleth hadn't seen her since. He didn't know whether to be relieved or afraid. The connection between them had been severed. The psychic link that had bound them together during the rituals broken by the overwhelming force of the storm. Now, all that remained was the presence, the terrible, insatiable presence that had grown stronger with each passing day. Caleth turned away from the balcony, his heart heavy with dread. The others in the city still clung to their old ways, still indulging in their pleasures, in their rituals, as if nothing had changed. But Caleth knew better. He had seen the visions, had felt the pull of the warp. Something was coming, something vast, something terrible, and it would not be denied. He descended the stairs of his estate, his feet moving automatically through the familiar halls, but his mind was elsewhere. He could feel the weight of the storm pressing down on him, and with every step the presence grew stronger, darker. The air felt thick with it, almost suffocating, and he could barely think past the oppressive force that bore down on his thoughts. Outside, the streets were eerily quiet. The few Eldar who remained walked in silence, their faces pale, their eyes distant. They felt it too. They had to. The whole city was on edge, the tension so thick it was almost palpable. But still, they carried on as if nothing was wrong, as if the end of the world wasn't bearing down on them. Caliph stopped in the middle of the street, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. He could feel it now, closer than ever. The presence, the thing that had been feeding off them for centuries, the thing that had grown fat on their indulgence and excess. It was here. It was ready.
And then it happened.
The sky above the city split open with a deafening crack, as though the heavens themselves had been torn apart. Caliph staggered, his hands flying to his head as a wave of psychic energy crashed over him, the force of it sending him to his knees. The air around him vibrated, the very fabric of reality warping and twisting as the storm broke through. And at the heart of the storm, Caliph felt it, Slaanesh, born in a single violent moment of psychic ecstasy and horror. It was a scream, a psychic scream that tore through the minds of every Eldar, a sound that was not heard but felt deep in the core of their beings, felt in the very essence of their souls. It was a scream of birth and death, of desire and destruction. A sound so overwhelming that it shattered minds, ripped apart bodies, and extinguished souls in an instant. Caliph cried out, clutching his head as the scream reverberated through him, threatening to tear him apart from the inside. He could feel it, Slaanesh, reaching out, its dark tendrils sinking into the minds of every Eldar, pulling them toward it, consuming them. He could feel the presence of the god, vast and terrible, filling the sky, filling the warp, filling everything. Around him, the city was disintegrating. The buildings, once so proud and tall, crumbled as the storm of psychic energy tore through them. The ground cracked and split open, great chasms swallowing the streets, the towers, the people. The very air shimmered with the force of the warp bleeding into real space, warping and distorting everything it touched. Eldar fell where they stood, their eyes wide with terror, their minds shattered by the psychic onslaught. Caliph could hear their screams, both in the air and in his mind, echoing through the city, a chorus of agony and despair, as their souls were ripped from their bodies, consumed by the ravenous hunger of Slaanesh. He tried to stand, but his legs refused to obey. The force of the storm pressed him down, pinning him to the ground, his mind barely holding together under the weight of the god's presence. He could feel his own soul slipping, could feel Slaanesh's hunger reaching for him, trying to devour him as it had devoured so many others. But somehow he resisted. He didn't know how, didn't know why, but he clung to that last fragment of himself, that last piece of his soul that hadn't yet been consumed. He could feel the dark tendrils of Slaanesh wrapping around him, pulling at him, but he held on, refusing to let go. The storm raged on, tearing apart the city, tearing apart the world, and Caliph could feel the very fabric of reality unraveling around him. The warp had broken through, the boundary between real space and the immaterium shattered, and now the two were bleeding into one another, warping and twisting in ways that defied comprehension. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The scream faded, the sky slowly knitting itself back together, the warp retreating back into the void. But the damage had been done. The city, no, the entire empire, was in ruins. What had once been a sprawling, vibrant civilization was now little more than ash and rubble. The streets were littered with the bodies of Eldar, their eyes staring blankly at the sky, their souls gone, devoured by the god they had unknowingly birthed. Caliph lay in the middle of the street, his body trembling, his mind numb. The presence of Slaanesh still lingered in the air, faint but undeniable, a constant reminder of the god's hunger, of its insatiable desire. He could feel it even now, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting, watching. The birth of Slaanesh had torn a hole in the fabric of the universe. The Eye of Terror, a gaping wound in reality, pulsed with dark energy in the heart of the galaxy, a permanent scar left by the cataclysmic birth of the god of excess. And now, that wound would never heal. The Eldar were broken. Their empire, once the greatest in the galaxy, was gone. All that remained were the few who had managed to survive, scattered across the stars, haunted by the knowledge that their own actions, their own excess, had brought about their doom. Caleth slowly pushed himself to his feet, his body weak, his mind still reeling from the psychic onslaught. The city around him was silent now, the only sound the faint crackle of fires burning in the distance. He looked up at the sky, his heart heavy with the weight of what had happened. They had fallen, they had birthed a god, and in doing so, they had destroyed themselves. And Slaanesh, she who thirsts, would never stop hungering. In the aftermath of Slaanesh's birth, the galaxy trembled. What had once been the heart of the Eldar Empire, the shining jewel of their civilization, was now nothing but a wasteland of shattered planets, broken souls, and swirling chaos. But the devastation was not confined to the physical realm. Far greater than the destruction of worlds was the rift that had torn open between the immaterium and real space, a wound in the fabric of the universe that would never heal. The Eye of Terror. Caleth stood at the edge of what had once been a world, but now was nothing more than a drifting husk, a graveyard of the Eldar's former glory. The sky above him was unlike anything he had ever seen, no longer the clear bright skies of their homeworlds, but a roiling storm of unnatural colors and shapes. The Eye of Terror dominated the horizon, a swirling vortex of pure warp energy, vast and terrible. It pulsed with dark light, tendrils of chaotic energy reaching out into real space, twisting and warping everything they touched. The Eye had been born in the same instant as Slaanesh, a physical manifestation of the god's violent birth. It was the wound left behind when the warp had torn through real space, when the psychic scream of the Eldar's annihilation had shattered the barrier between dimensions. Now it loomed over the galaxy, a constant reminder of the cataclysm that had wiped out an empire. Caleth could feel the pull of the Eye, the way it tugged at his soul, trying to draw him in. It was more than just a rift in space. It was a living thing, a gateway into the warp itself. And it was hungry. The warp had always been a dangerous place, an ever-shifting sea of energy, emotion, and madness. But now, with the Eye open, the warp was bleeding into the material world, its chaotic influence spreading like a disease. The once stable laws of reality were unraveling, and the universe was being reshaped by forces beyond comprehension. He could see it in the distance, whole worlds twisting and distorting as the warp touched them. Planets that had once been lush and vibrant were now dead, their surfaces scorched and cracked, their atmospheres choked with ash and fire. The warp storms that raged across the galaxy tore at the fabric of space, ripping apart anything that stood in their path. And the creatures that lurked within the warp, the demons and monsters that had once been confined to the immaterium, now spilled into real space with terrifying ease. The Eye of Terror was a doorway, a wound through which chaos itself could reach into the galaxy, and Slaanesh, the newborn god, was at the heart of it all. Caleth could still feel the presence of the god, distant but ever present, a constant pressure at the back of his mind. Slaanesh's hunger was insatiable, and Caleth knew that the god's thirst for Eldar souls would never be quenched. Even now, he could feel the faint pull of it, tugging at the edges of his consciousness, a reminder that no Eldar soul was safe, not in life, and certainly not in death. The weight of it all pressed down on him, and he sank to his knees, his hands gripping the cold, cracked ground. The once glorious empire of the Eldar was gone, consumed by the very pleasures they had once revelled in. And Caleth. He was one of the few who remained. A survivor, but for how long? He could feel the tendrils of despair creeping in, wrapping themselves around his heart. What was the point of surviving if they were already doomed? The Eldar had brought this upon themselves. Their arrogance, their indulgence had led them down this path, and now there was no turning back. Slaanesh was awake, and the Eye of Terror was open. The galaxy would never be the same again. Caleth. The voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a blade. Caleth looked up, his vision blurred with exhaustion. Standing before him, shrouded in the flickering light of the warp, was Farseer Melinos. Melinos. Caleth's voice cracked, his throat dry. He hadn't seen the Farseer since before the fall, before the last desperate warnings had been sent out to the core worlds. Seeing him here, now, felt almost unreal, as though the Farseer were a ghost, an echo of the world that had been. The eye has opened, Melinos said, his voice heavy with sorrow. It is, as we feared. Caleth nodded weakly, his eyes drifting back to the sky, to the swirling vortex that dominated the heavens. It's worse than I imagined. It will only get worse. Melinos stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the eye. The galaxy is changing. Chaos has gained a foothold, and the warp will continue to spread. Slaanesh's birth has unleashed something we cannot control. Caleth looked up at him, a flicker of anger sparking in his chest. Then what's the point? Why did we survive if this is all that's left? Why did we flee to the craft worlds if we're just going to be hunted down by Slaanesh? Melinos was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly, he knelt beside Caleth, his gaze softening. Because we are all that's left, he said quietly. Because we are the only hope for our people. Hope, Caleth's laugh was bitter, hollow. What hope is there in this? He gestured to the sky, to the endless storm that raged above them. The Eye of Terror is open, Melinos. Slaanesh will never stop hunting us. The Eldar are finished. The Eldar as they were, yes, Melinos agreed, his tone grave. But we are not the same Eldar we once were. We have seen what our excesses have wrought, and we will not make the same mistakes again. Caleth shook his head, the weight of his despair pressing down on him. It doesn't matter. We're already damned. Slaanesh will devour us all eventually. It's only a matter of time. Melinos placed a hand on Caleth's shoulder, his grip firm. Not if we fight, not if we resist. Resist? Caleth stared at him, incredulous. How do we resist a god? With wisdom, Melinos said, his voice steady. With discipline. We will not give in to the same temptations that destroyed us. The path forward is one of control, of focus. We must bind ourselves to the paths, to the disciplines of the craft worlds. If we allow ourselves to be consumed by emotion, by indulgence, Slaanesh will have us. But if we remain disciplined, if we control our desires, we can keep the Dark Prince at bay. Caleth wanted to believe him. He wanted to believe that there was a way out, that there was still hope for the Eldar. But the presence of the Eye of Terror loomed too large, too close. It was a constant reminder of their doom, a gaping wound in the universe that would never heal. How? Caleth whispered. How can we live with this? With that? He gestured again to the sky, to the eye that pulsed with dark energy, casting its shadow over everything. Melinos's expression hardened. We don't live with it, we fight it. Every day, with every breath, We fight the temptation to give in to the darkness, to the hunger. We protect our souls, Caleth, because that is all we have left. Caleth closed his eyes, his mind a whirl of emotion. He wanted to fight. He wanted to believe that they could resist, that they could survive. But the weight of the eye, the pull of Slaanesh, was overwhelming. "We are the last of our kind," Melanos continued, his voice firm. "We must protect what remains of the Eldar, even if it means living in the shadow of our greatest failure." The eye of terror flickered in the distance, its tendrils of chaotic energy reaching ever further into real space, spreading the influence of the warp across the galaxy. It was a reminder of the cataclysm that had destroyed the Eldar, a wound that would never heal. But as Caleth looked up at it, at the swirling maelstrom that had once been the heart of their empire, he felt something stir inside him. Perhaps it was hope, perhaps it was defiance, perhaps it was simply the need to survive. He didn't know. All he knew was that he wasn't ready to give in just yet. "We'll fight," Caleth said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll fight." And with that, the remnants of the Eldar turned their backs on the Eye of Terror and prepared for the long struggle that lay ahead. The fall had left the Eldar shattered, not just in body but in spirit. Their once unified empire, a shining beacon across the stars, was gone, torn apart by the birth of Slaanesh and the opening of the Eye of Terror. What had once been the most advanced and powerful civilization in the galaxy was now a broken people, scattered and divided. The Eldar, once masters of the stars, had been reduced to remnants, clinging to the edges of the universe, haunted by their past, and hunted by the god they had unknowingly created. Caleth walked the quiet halls of his craft world, the faint hum of psychic energy vibrating through the wraithbone structure beneath his feet. It was quiet here, too quiet. The craft worlds, once brimming with life and purpose, now felt hollow, as though the very soul of the Eldar had been ripped away along with their empire. The survivors moved like shadows through the halls, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes haunted by the memories of what they had lost. It had been months since they had fled the core worlds, since they had left behind the ruins of their home, and yet the weight of it all still pressed down on them. The craft worlds had been designed as sanctuaries, places where the Eldar could preserve their culture, their way of life. But now they felt more like tombs, silent, empty, filled with the ghosts of a once great people. Caleth had never imagined it would come to this. He had grown up in the heart of the Empire, surrounded by beauty, by art, by the endless pleasures that had once defined the Eldar way of life. He had taken it all for granted, never questioning the path they were on, never imagining that it could all end so suddenly. But the fall had torn everything apart, and now all that remained were fragments of what had once been. The survivors were few. Most of the Eldar had been devoured by Slaanesh in the first moments of the god's birth, their souls ripped from their bodies and consumed by the insatiable hunger of the Dark Prince. Those who had escaped had done so by luck or by foresight, fleeing aboard the craft worlds before the final cataclysm. But even those who had survived were not safe. Slaanesh's hunger was eternal, and every Eldar soul was a prize to the god of excess. Even in death, they were not free. Caleth paused by a window, his gaze drifting out into the void of space. The stars blinked faintly in the distance, cold and distant. He had spent so much of his life surrounded by light, by the vibrancy of their worlds, and now all that remained was the emptiness of the void. It felt wrong, as though the universe itself had turned its back on them. A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Caleth." He turned to see Lyrian, her face pale, her expression weary. She had been one of the first to join the Exodus, one of the few who had heeded the warnings of the Seers. Now, like so many others, she bore the weight of survival, the guilt of knowing that they had escaped when so many others had not. "How are they?" Calith asked quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Lyrian sighed, her gaze drifting to the floor. "Struggling. The path helps, but it's hard. They're haunted, Calith. We all are. The path." It was the only thing that kept them from falling into the same excesses that had destroyed their empire. The Seers had established it as a way to guide the survivors, to keep their emotions, their desires in check. Each Eldar now followed a strict path, whether it was the path of the seer, the path of the warrior, or the path of the artisan. It was a way of life, a discipline that allowed them to focus their minds, to control their emotions. Without it, they risked falling prey to the same temptations that had led to the birth of Slaanesh. Without it, they risked damnation. "I know," Calith said, his voice heavy. "I feel it too." Lyrian nodded, her eyes meeting his. "Do you ever wonder if it was worth it? Surviving, I mean." Calith didn't answer right away. He didn't know how to. The question had been gnawing at him since the day they had fled the core worlds. Was this survival? Was this life? They had escaped Slaanesh's immediate grasp, but they were still hunted, still cursed. Every day was a struggle, not just to survive, but to keep their souls intact. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice hollow. "I don't know if any of this was worth it." Lyrian sighed again, her gaze drifting back to the window. "I suppose we don't have a choice now, do we?" No, they didn't. The craft worlds were all they had left, and they had to make the best of it. But it was hard. The survivors were scattered, spread thin across the galaxy, and each craft world felt more isolated than the last. They had no empire, no home, just the cold expanse of space, and the knowledge that they were all that remained of a doomed race. And then there were the others. Not all the Eldar had chosen the path of the craft worlds. Calith had heard the stories, the rumors of those who had fled into the webway, the ancient network of tunnels and portals that crisscrossed the galaxy, hidden from the prying eyes of the warp. The Drukhari, they called themselves now, the Dark Eldar. They had chosen a different path, one that rejected the discipline of the craft worlds, one that embraced the very excesses that had led to their downfall. The Drukhari had found a way to survive in the shadows, hidden deep within the webway, beyond the reach of Slaanesh. But their survival came at a price. They fed on the suffering of others, draining the pain and fear of their captives to sustain themselves. It was a twisted mockery of the Eldar's former glory, and Calith could barely stomach the thought of it. But it was survival of a sort. And then there were the Exodites, those who had fled long before the fall, abandoning the decadent ways of the Empire to live simple agrarian lives on distant, unspoiled worlds. They had seen the rot that had taken root in the heart of Eldar society, and they had chosen to leave before it consumed them. Now they lived in isolation, far from the reaches of the craft worlds, far from the influence of Slaanesh. But even they were not safe. No Eldar was safe anymore. The remnants of the Eldar were scattered across the stars, each group clinging to a different hope, a different way of life. But none of them were free from the shadow of Slaanesh. The god's hunger was insatiable, and every Eldar soul, no matter where they hid, was a target. Calith turned away from the window, his heart heavy with the weight of it all. The craft worlds, the Drukhari, the Exodites, they were all just fragments of a broken race, remnants of a people who had once ruled the stars. And now they were nothing more than shadows, drifting through the void, trying to survive in a galaxy that no longer had a place for them. But what else could they do? "We carry on," he said quietly, more to himself than to Lyrian. "We survive, because that's all we can do." Lyrian looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sorrow and determination. "Yes," she agreed softly, "we survive." And so, the remnants of the Eldar, scattered across the stars, divided by fate, haunted by their past, continued their long, slow journey through the galaxy. The craft worlds drifted in the cold expanse of space, their wraithbone halls silent, their people bound by the paths that kept their souls from falling into the abyss. The Drukhari hunted in the shadows of the webway, feeding on the pain of others to stave off the hunger of Slaanesh. The Exodites lived quietly on distant worlds, far from the reach of the galaxy's chaos. But no matter where they were, no matter how far they ran, the shadow of Slaanesh would always follow. They were a doomed race, after all. As the Eldar Empire crumbled, as worlds burned and the souls of their people were consumed by Slaanesh, not all who survived fled to the craft worlds or chose the quiet isolation of the Exodites. There were some who had seen the warnings and ignored them, who had witnessed the horror of the fall and did not flinch. These Eldar refused to abandon the decadent pleasures that had once defined their empire. They had tasted power, indulgence, and excess, and they craved more. Rather than turning away from the path that had destroyed their people, they embraced it. These were the Eldar who would become the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar. The webway, that vast network of tunnels and pathways that wound through the Immaterium, had been a refuge for the Eldar for millennia. Built by their ancestors long before the fall, the webway had allowed them to travel between worlds without ever touching the dangers of the warp. But in the chaos of Slaanesh's birth, the webway had become more than a transportation system. It had become a sanctuary. The craft-world Eldar had fled to their great ships, drifting through real space in isolation. But the Drukhari had chosen a different refuge. They had retreated into the depths of the webway, hiding in the labyrinthine passages that stretched between the stars. Here they found safety from the birth of Slaanesh, from the cataclysm that had torn their empire apart. But the price of that safety was steep. In the heart of the webway, far from the eyes of their craft-world kin, the Drukhari built a city. It was not a city like those of the old empire, not a place of light and beauty. This was a city born of darkness, of cruelty, of suffering. They named it Comora. It began as little more than a gathering of survivors, Eldar, who had been part of the cults of excess that had thrived in the final days of the empire. These cults had pushed the boundaries of sensation, of psychic pleasure, and in doing so, they had fed the growing presence of Slaanesh. But now, in the aftermath of the fall, they had found a new purpose. Comora was built on pain, on the suffering of others. It grew quickly, its twisted spires rising high in the dim, flickering light of the webway, a monument to the Drukhari's dark ambitions. Here, they could continue the pursuit of pleasure, but it was a pleasure that had become tainted, corrupted. The Drukhari had learned the hard way that indulgence came with a price. Slaanesh had been born from their excess, and now the god hunted their souls. To escape that fate, to stave off the inevitable pull of the Dark Prince's hunger, the Drukhari had found a new way to feed themselves. They fed on pain. In Comora, the Drukhari learned that by inflicting suffering on others, by drawing out their pain and fear, they could sustain themselves. They could slow the pull of Slaanesh's hunger, delaying the inevitable consumption of their souls. The more they inflicted, the more they could stave off the god's thirst. And so they did. They hunted, they tortured, they reveled in the agony of their victims, draining their life force to keep themselves alive. This was the birth of the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar. They had become parasites, feeding on the misery of others, sustaining themselves through cruelty and suffering. Comora grew, its population swelling as more and more survivors of the fall made their way into the webway, drawn to the dark promise of survival through pain. Navarra, once a high priestess of the pleasure cults, was among the first to embrace this new way of life. In the final days of the Empire, she had led the gatherings that had pushed the limits of sensation, rituals that had fed the presence of Slaanesh, unknowingly contributing to the god's birth. Now, in the aftermath of the fall, she had become something darker, something far more dangerous. In Commorragh, she found herself surrounded by like-minded souls, Eldar, who had no intention of abandoning their old ways, who saw the fall not as a punishment, but as an opportunity. Under Navarra's leadership, the Drukhari cults flourished. She had always been a master of manipulation, of drawing others into her web, and now, in Commorragh, she took that skill to new heights. The city became a place of endless indulgence, but it was an indulgence that came at the expense of others. The Drukhari took captives from across the galaxy, humans, orcs, other Eldar, and brought them to the dark heart of their city, where they were subjected to unspeakable tortures. Their suffering was drawn out, carefully orchestrated to maximize the pain, to wring every last drop of fear and despair from their souls. The Drukhari didn't just revel in the suffering, they fed on it. In the darkest chambers of Commorragh, the captive's agony was transformed into power, into sustenance. The more pain they inflicted, the more the Drukhari could feel themselves slipping free of Slaanesh's grasp, if only for a little while. But it was never enough. The hunger of Slaanesh was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting to devour them the moment they let their guard down. And so, they never stopped. The Drukhari were no longer Eldar in the way their Craftworld kin were. The Craftworld Eldar had turned to discipline, to rigid control over their emotions and desires, following the paths laid out by their Seers to protect their souls from Slaanesh's hunger. The Drukhari had chosen a different path, a path of indulgence, of excess, of cruelty. They had rejected the paths, choosing instead to embrace the very things that had brought about the fall. But unlike the Eldar of the old empire, they had learned to harness their indulgence, to control it. They didn't lose themselves to the pleasures of the flesh or the ecstasy of psychic power. Instead, they channeled those desires into something darker, something sharper. They inflicted pain, not because it brought them pleasure, but because it kept them alive. For the Drukhari, survival was a delicate balance. They had to feed on the suffering of others to stave off the hunger of Slaanesh, but they could never truly escape it. The Dark Prince's shadow hung over them, a constant reminder of the price they had paid for their indulgence. And so they continued to feed, to torture, to drain the life force of their captives, knowing that the moment they stopped, the moment they let their guard down, Slaanesh would come for them. Commorragh became a twisted reflection of the old empire, a city built on indulgence, but one that was sustained by suffering. The spires of the city rose high into the sky, their dark shapes silhouetted against the flickering light of the webway. The streets were filled with Drukhari, their faces sharp and cruel, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that could never be sated. The sounds of the city were not the sounds of music and laughter, as they had been in the old empire. They were the sounds of screams, of pain, of the endless torment that sustained the Drukhari. But for all its darkness, for all its cruelty, Commorragh was a place of survival. The Drukhari had found a way to live, to escape the fate that had claimed so many of their kin. They had rejected the paths of the Craftworlds, rejected the quiet isolation of the Exodites, and had instead embraced the darkness. And in doing so, they had become something new, something stronger. They were the Drukhari, the Dark Eldar. They had chosen a path of pain and suffering, but in that suffering, they had found a way to survive. And as long as they could feed on the agony of others, as long as they could inflict pain, they would continue to live, defying Slaanesh's hunger for as long as they could. But deep down, they knew that their time was borrowed. Slaanesh would never stop hunting them, never stop hungering for their souls, and so they would continue to feed, to torture, to drain the life from the galaxy, always one step ahead of the Dark Prince's grasp. Because to stop was to die, and for the Drukhari there was nothing worse than death. Long before the fall, when the first whispers of excess began to ripple through Eldar society, a few had already seen the danger. These Eldar were visionaries, not mystics like the Seers, but practical souls who recognized that their empire was walking a path toward ruin. They looked around at the spiraling decadence, the unchecked indulgence, and the hollow pleasures that had come to dominate their once great civilization, and they knew that something was wrong. These Eldar chose a different path, a path of retreat, of self-exile. They forsook the glittering cities, the star-spanning empire, and the intoxicating allure of endless luxury. They sought instead a simpler life, away from the corruption and rot they saw spreading through their people. These were the Exodites, were not like the vibrant crafted paradises of the Eldar Empire. They were untamed, wild, and often hostile. To most Eldar, these planets would have been seen as primitive, beneath the attention of such a refined race. But to the Exodites, they were sanctuaries. These worlds offered the purity that had been lost in the heart of their civilization, the purity of nature, of struggle, of balance. The Exodites carved out lives on these worlds, learning to live in harmony with the natural order, taming what they could, and adapting to what they could not. They abandoned the sophisticated technology and psychic luxuries of their former lives, choosing instead to live by simpler means. It was not an easy life. They worked the land with their own hands, built their homes from the raw materials of their worlds, and fought off the dangers that lurked in the wilderness. But it was a life that gave them something they had lost in the heart of the Empire: purpose. Caleth had never understood the Exodites, not when they first began their exodus, nor during the final days of the Empire. He had seen them as outcasts, as reactionaries who had rejected the gifts of the Eldar's progress in favor of a backward, primitive existence. He had even laughed at their departure, thinking them foolish for turning away from the perfection their race had achieved. But now, standing on the soil of an Exodite world, Caleth could only envy them. The air here was fresh, untouched by the pollutants and warp-touched energies that had once filled the skies of the Eldar homeworlds. The forests were alive with sound, the calls of strange creatures echoing through the trees, the wind rustling through the leaves. This was a world of life, a place where the Exodites had forged a future far from the madness that had consumed the rest of their race. Caleth watched as a group of Exodites passed by, their clothing simple, their faces calm. They carried tools and weapons, not the sleek, psychically enhanced artifacts of the old empire, but hand-forged practical instruments designed for survival. These Eldar were not the aloof, decadent aristocrats he had once known. They were strong, weathered by hard labor and the demands of the land. They had found a way to survive, not by bending the world to their will, but by learning to live within its limits. It was a stark contrast to the lives they had left behind. In the heart of the Empire, the Eldar had shaped reality itself to suit their desires. They had bent the warp to their will, crafted entire ecosystems to their liking, and lived in a world where nothing was beyond their reach. But in doing so, they had lost sight of what it meant to live in balance with the universe. They had grown arrogant, thinking themselves gods, untouchable by the natural order. The Exodites had seen this arrogance for what it was. They had seen the danger long before the fall, and they had acted, leaving behind the false paradise of their empire to forge a new life on the frontier. And now, in the aftermath of the cataclysm, it was the Exodites who had survived, who had escaped the birth of Slaanesh and the destruction of their people. But their survival had come at a cost. The Exodites had chosen to live far from the protection of the webway and the psychic barriers that had once shielded the core worlds of the Eldar Empire. Their worlds were isolated, distant from the heart of the galaxy, and as a result, they were vulnerable. The dangers of the universe were many, and the Exodite worlds were not immune to them. Raiders, Xenos, and even Chaos forces could threaten their way of life, and without the advanced technology of the old Empire, the Exodites had to rely on their own strength to defend themselves. They had become warriors in a way the Eldar of the old Empire had never been. They fought not for conquest, not for power, but for survival. The Exodites had developed a deep connection to their worlds, seeing themselves not as rulers of the land, but as its guardians. They fought alongside the great beasts that roamed their planets, creatures they had learned to tame and bond with. These dragons, as they were sometimes called, were massive, armored beasts that the Exodites used as living weapons, riding them into battle against any who threatened their way of life. Caleth had seen one of these creatures when he first arrived on the Exodite world. It had been a towering serpentine beast, its scales glinting in the sunlight, its eyes filled with a primal intelligence. The sight of it had been both awe-inspiring and humbling, a reminder that even in the far reaches of the galaxy, life could flourish in ways he had never imagined. The Exodites lived in balance with these creatures, as they did with the land itself. They took only what they needed, always careful to maintain the delicate harmony that sustained their worlds. It was a far cry from the reckless excess that had defined the old Empire, where the Eldar had consumed resources without thought for the consequences. Here, on these distant worlds, the Exodites had found a way to live in harmony with the universe, a way to survive without falling into the same traps that had led to the fall. But even here, even on the Exodite worlds, the shadow of Slaanesh loomed. The Exodites may have escaped the immediate destruction of the fall, but they had not escaped the curse that now hung over all Eldar. Slaanesh's hunger was eternal, and no Eldar soul was safe from its grasp. The Exodites knew this, and they had taken steps to protect themselves. Like the craft world Eldar, the Exodites used spirit stones to trap their souls upon death, preventing them from being devoured by Slaanesh. These stones, carefully crafted and blessed, were worn at all times, a constant reminder of the danger that lurked in the warp. But the Exodites did not live in fear. They had accepted their fate, accepted that they would always be hunted by the god of excess. They knew that death would come for them, as it came for all things, but they refused to let that knowledge define their lives. They lived with purpose, with a quiet strength that came from their connection to the land, to their worlds, to each other. They had built something lasting, something real, something that could survive the chaos of the galaxy. In a way, Caleth envied them. They had found a peace that he doubted he would ever know. As the sun began to set over the horizon, casting the Exodite village in a warm, golden light, Caleth felt a sense of calm settle over him. He had come to this world seeking answers, seeking some kind of peace in the aftermath of the fall. And while he wasn't sure he had found the answers he was looking for, he had found something else, something deeper. The Exodites had chosen a path that was difficult, that required sacrifice and struggle, but it was a path that had allowed them to survive. They had turned their backs on the excesses of the old empire, on the false promises of power and pleasure, and had found a way to live in harmony with the universe. It wasn't the life Caleth had known, but it was a life, one that offered a chance for renewal, for redemption. Perhaps, in the end, that was all any of them could hope for. As the last light of the day faded from the sky, Caleth turned away from the village, his heart heavy but resolute. The Exodites had found their place in the galaxy, and now it was time for him to find his. Caleth stood on the edge of the craft world's observation deck, staring out into the cold, unfeeling void. The stars glittered distantly, cold and remote, their light offering no warmth, no solace. Beyond them, hidden in the dark expanse, lay the Eye of Terror, pulsing with chaotic energy. A gaping wound in reality, the scar left by the birth of Slaanesh. It was the legacy of the Eldar, the greatest sin of their once glorious empire, and it would haunt them for all eternity. For centuries, the Eldar had been a race of gods, masters of the galaxy, bending the very fabric of reality to their will. But they had not been content with power, with knowledge, with immortality. They had hungered for more pleasure, more sensation, more ecstasy, and in their pursuit of excess, they had sown the seeds of their own destruction. The birth of Slaanesh had been the culmination of their arrogance, their blindness, and now the galaxy paid the price. The remnants of the Eldar were scattered across the stars, a broken, dying race, forever hunted by the god they had unleashed upon the universe. The craft worlds drifted through space, their inhabitants bound by the paths, rigid disciplines that kept their emotions, their desires, in check. The Exodites lived quietly on their distant worlds, far from the chaos and temptation of the galaxy, eking out a simple existence in harmony with the land. The Drukhari hid in the depths of the webway, feeding on pain and suffering to stave off Slaanesh's hunger. Their souls as twisted and dark as the city they had built. But no matter where they went, no matter how far they fled, Slaanesh's shadow loomed over them all. Every Eldar soul, no matter how disciplined or defiant, was a prize to the Dark Prince. In the end, death was not an escape. It was only the beginning of an eternal torment in the clutches of She Who Thirsts. Calith had felt the presence of Slaanesh in the warp every day since the fall. It was a constant pressure, a gnawing hunger at the edge of his mind. Always there, always waiting. Every Eldar felt it, even if they didn't speak of it. It was the reason they followed the paths, the reason they kept their emotions so tightly controlled. To let their guard down, even for a moment, was to risk falling into the abyss. He took a deep breath, his hand tightening around the spirit stone that hung around his neck. The smooth, crystalline surface pulsed faintly with psychic energy, a reminder that even in death, the Eldar were not free. The spirit stone was their only defense, their only chance at escaping the clutches of Slaanesh. When an Eldar died, their soul was drawn into the stone, trapped in its psychic matrix, safe from the god's ravenous hunger. But even then, they were not truly free. Their souls would be placed into the Infinity Circuit, an artificial afterlife housed within the craft worlds, where they would exist in a state of eternal limbo. It was a cruel fate, Calith thought, but it was better than the alternative. Behind him, he could hear the faint hum of activity as the craft world's inhabitants went about their lives. The paths gave them structure, purpose, and discipline, but they could not erase the guilt, the shame that hung over them. The Eldar had once been proud, arrogant, confident in their superiority over all other races. Now they were a shadow of their former selves, clinging to survival in a galaxy that no longer belonged to them. "We're a doomed race," Calith murmured to himself, the words heavy with resignation. "Perhaps," a voice said from behind him, "but we are not yet finished." Calith turned to see Farsia Melanos approaching, his long robes trailing behind him, the faint glow of the craft world's psychic energy reflecting in his eyes. He moved with the grace and calm of one who had seen the future and accepted its burdens, but there was a weight to his presence, a sadness that could not be hidden. "We survived," Melanos continued, stepping up beside Calith to gaze out at the stars. "That alone is something." Calith shook his head. "Surviving isn't enough. What are we now? What are we fighting for? Our empire is gone. Our people are broken. We've lost everything." "Not everything," Melanos said quietly. "We still have our souls. As long as we have that, there is hope." "Hope?" Calith's laugh was bitter. Hope for what? Even if we survive 1,000 more years, Slaanesh will still be waiting for us at the end. Every Eldar who dies, every soul that escapes to the Infinity Circuit, it's all just delaying the inevitable. Melanos nodded slowly, his gaze distant. It's true. We cannot escape Slaanesh forever. The Dark Prince will hunt us until the end of time. But we are not the same Eldar who once ruled the stars. We have learned, Caliph. We have learned from our mistakes, and we will not repeat them. That is what we fight for now. Not to rebuild what we lost, but to preserve what we have, to ensure that our people, though doomed, do not fade away into oblivion. Caliph stared at the Farseer, his mind grappling with the weight of his words. He wanted to argue, to rail against the futility of it all, but he couldn't. There was truth in what Melanos said. They had survived when so many others had not. They had found a way to protect their souls, to resist the lure of Slaanesh's hunger, even if only for a time. And in that there was something worth preserving. But how long can we last? Caliph asked, his voice soft. How long can we keep running from Slaanesh? As long as we need to, Melanos replied. We are Eldar. We have lived for millennia, and we will continue to live for millennia more. Slaanesh may be patient, but so are we. We have our paths, our craft worlds, our spirit stones. We will endure. Endure. It wasn't the future Caliph had once imagined for his people. It wasn't the future any of them had imagined, but it was the only future they had left. The age of the Eldar Empire was over, and what remained of their race was scattered, divided, and broken. But they were still here, still fighting, still surviving. And in that, perhaps, there was a small glimmer of hope. Caliph turned back to the stars, his hands still resting on his spirit stone. The cold void stretched out before him, vast and indifferent, but it no longer filled him with despair. He had seen what the Exodites had built on their distant worlds, had felt the strength of the craft worlds, had witnessed the resilience of his people in the face of overwhelming odds. They were a doomed race, yes, but they were not yet defeated. We will endure, Caliph said quietly, his voice resolute, for as long as we can. Melanos smiled faintly, his eyes still fixed on the stars. Yes, we will. And as they stood together on the edge of the craft world, the remnants of a fallen empire, the shadow of Slaanesh loomed over them, a constant reminder of their doom. But they were Eldar. They had survived the birth of a god, the destruction of their empire, and the scattering of their people. They would endure, even in the face of death itself, because they had no other choice.